Hey everybody, welcome to your Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. Denise Beck here, Executive Director of Velvet Ashes. I just finished listening to this month's episode and you're in for a treat. Sarah Hilkeman, our Director of Operations, and Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer do a fantastic job of bringing awareness to a lesser known story that has great impact in the world of missions and women. Do you know those kind of people that are just really great connectors? They are bringing awareness and doing a lot of the groundwork that makes something possible, but they aren't actually the ones on the ground doing the work that they're raising awareness for. Well, that's somebody you will get to meet on this month's Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. Helen Barrett Montgomery was just that type of a person, and she used her gifts and platforms that honestly put her in a lot of leadership positions to eventually travel the world and bring awareness to the work that women were doing in the missions movement of her day. I think you'll find this fascinating. I hope you listen to it, and it brings to mind all of the people that God puts in your paths that have been that for you and the work that you are doing, bringing awareness, bringing encouragement, and honestly igniting passion in the lives of those who would someday be those who are on the field working side by side with you. Thanks again to Barnabas International for sponsoring this podcast. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy this month's Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Sarah Hilkeman, and I'm joined today by Dr. Laura Chevalier Beer. Hey Laura.
Hi there.
So friends, this season on the podcast, we have had the opportunity to hear from different experts as they share about the life of a woman from the past who has impacted them or that they just have had the opportunity to learn a lot about. And today we have a special guest who's going to be sharing about the life of Helen Barrett Montgomery. Laura, tell us about our guest who's joining us today.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to introduce our Velvet Ashes community to Dr. Kendal P. Mobley. He's also known as Kip, and he's someone that I was introduced to by a colleague of mine who's actually been a guest on this podcast, Dr. Daryl Ireland. And he recommended that I reach out to Kip because he knew that he was working on a new or a revised edition of a book that he had been writing about Helen Barrett Montgomery. So Kip graciously agreed to join us here today. And let me just tell you a little bit about who he is. Kip joined the faculty of Johnson C. Smith University in 2014, where he serves as a professor of religion. And his research interests include early 20th century evangelical Protestantism, American civil religion, and religious pluralism in American culture. And the book that he revised is his 2009 book, Helen Barrett Montgomery, The Global Mission of Domestic Feminism. Interesting title there. I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that today. And that book is included in the 25-26 book list of Baylor University Press. He also wrote an article that appeared in the April 2024 edition of the American Baptist Quarterly, and it was called Democratizing the New Testament, the Centenary Translation and the Montgomery New Testament in the Context of Helen Barrett Montgomery's Missional Theology. So prior to his academic career, Dr. Mobley was a church planter with the Southern Baptist Convention in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and he also served as a Baptist pastor in Massachusetts and in North Carolina. So he's got a lot of experience both as a practitioner and as a researcher and academic. So we're so excited for you to be with us here today, Kip, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's just dive right in. How did you become interested in Helen Barrett Montgomery? It's probably someone that some of our listeners have never heard of. So just tell us about how you became interested.
Yeah, I had never heard of her, even though I grew up Baptist, until I got to Boston University and I was doing the coursework for my THD at Boston University. And Dana Robert was teaching a seminar called American Women in Mission. She'd published a book by that same title a year or two before. And so I was part of the seminar, and I needed a topic for my seminar research paper, and I couldn't come up with anything. So she advised me to go over to Andover Newton Theological School and to go into their library and just read through their Baptist periodicals until I found something that, piqued my interest. So I did that. I went over and just pulled up the Baptist periodicals alphabetically. The first one alphabetically was one called The Baptist, oddly enough, right? And it was published by the Northern Baptist Convention in the 1920s. And I started reading through the series, and just about every other issue had some kind of item in it by Helen Barrett Montgomery. And they were really interesting, and I was curious, and so I looked her up in Dana's book and found out that she was a really important leader in the ecumenical women's missionary movement, and that there wasn't much written about her. So I started researching her then, and that turned into my dissertation, and I've been writing about her kind of on and off ever since.
I just love that your professor recognized kind of your background and was telling you, in essence, go and look into your history of
Right.
your tradition, and then now you're bringing to light things that probably other people in your tradition weren't aware of.
Yeah, and since I've written about her, of course, there were a few things by other people before my dissertation that became my book. But since then, there's been more published about her. And, my book is going to be a second edition of my book is going to be coming out in the next, hopefully, year or so. And I'm also aware that there is a book going to be written by a couple of other Baptist scholars that focuses entirely on her New Testament translation that we'll talk about later on. Mm-hmm. So there's more coming about Helen Barrett Montgomery.
Well, I so appreciate you and others that don't let us forget about these women who have had such an impact. I mean, that's really the heart of this podcast, is that we don't forget the stories of these women. And yeah, how many others, if there is not someone, combing through the archives, are lost to us. So yeah, excited to learn more about Helen. And as we get into more of her story, can you talk about kind of her early life, help us understand her childhood, her family? Yeah, are there any stories that you can tell us about her youth?
Sure, yeah. So she was born in 1861 in Kingsville, Ohio, where her paternal grandparents made their home. And on her father's side, her folks were all, on both sides of her family, they were all Baptists. Her father's side, her grandparents were devout Baptists. They practiced family prayer. They had the children do spelling bees in the home, spelling drills. They taught their children and grandchildren the Bible. And Helen wrote that they frowned on hair curling and gum chewing and pantalettes and parties. So she had a pretty strict Baptist upbringing. Now, on her mother's side, her grandfather was an amateur scientist who, for years and years, reported weather observations to the Smithsonian Institute based on observations made on his very own barometer that he had made. And so he was curious about science and got put out of the Baptist church because he insisted on studying geology, and the other members of the church felt like that threatened the authority of the Genesis account of creation. And so there was this intellectual curiosity along with the piety in her background. And when she was about 7 years old, her father became the principal of an academy in Lowville, New York. And so they moved to Lowville. And of course, this was 1868. And, the South is still under Reconstruction. Feelings around the Civil War are still high. And Helen's new playmates that she was just becoming acquainted with asked her if her father was a Republican. And she didn't know what a Republican was, but she knew that in the New Testament, there were these people called the publicans, and they were sinners.
Oh, dear.
And so she denied that her father was a Republican pretty strongly, and word got around, and the folks in town came to visit Amos Judson Barrett, and made him defend his politics, right? Because his daughter had said that he was not a Republican. So I thought that was a pretty funny story, and kind of just gives a good sense of how she grew up.
Yeah, it's so interesting, like what gets passed down to kids, that this conversation was happening, with her playmates, and then it like came back around to her father of, we need to check on this.
Right.
So yeah.
So as she was growing up, were there some formative experiences that shaped her faith within her family context or elsewhere?
So her father transitioned from being an educator to being a pastor. He went to Rochester Theological Seminary and then became pastor of Lake Avenue Baptist Church in Rochester, New York in 1876. And at that time, Helen was about 15 years old, and the experience of being a pastor's daughter, I think, and being in that church was very important. Formative experience in her life. Her father really was the most important influence on her when she was growing up. He was her first teacher. Since he was an educator, he educated his children at home until she got to be, I think, 12 or 13 years old, and then she went to a girls' school. He was just the most important influence. She loved her mother, but she revered her father and wanted to be like him. And so when he became a pastor, that was a very important experience for her. Soon after he became a pastor, she presented herself for baptism to join the church. And in the Baptist tradition, especially back then, when you presented yourself for church membership, they inquired into your Christian experience. And so they asked you to give an account of your salvation experience. And one of the older deacons asked her if she had felt the burden of sin roll away when she trusted in Christ. And she said, I did. She was surprised by the question because, here she was. She'd grown up in a Christian home all of her life. She felt like she'd been a Christian and she had trusted Jesus all of her life. But she knew what the right answer to the question was. She knew that the right answer to the question was yes. And so she answered yes, even though later on when she reflected on that, she felt like she'd been in the position of having to tell a lie to get into the church because she didn't have that dramatic conversion experience to testify to. And so she felt a little bit of bitterness, I think, about that. She said, I had told a lie in order to get into the church. It filled me with bitterness at the very moment when a gracious Father was welcoming me into the household of faith.
Yeah, I wonder if any of our listeners can kind of relate a little bit to her experience. Maybe not the telling the lie, but just like growing up in an evangelical tradition where it's kind of expected that you have this dramatic conversion. I know for one, I grew up in a Christian home too, and it was kind of like I had to look at different points and kind of figure out, okay, what was my journey like? And I don't know, I think that's probably something that a lot of people could relate to, of feeling like, oh, I don't have that traditional evangelical kind of experience.
Yeah, she knew she was supposed to give the right answer, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, she had a lot of very positive and meaningful experiences in that church as well. She, again, she was 15 years old when she joined the church. She taught a Sunday school class for young boys in the church, and she also took on the responsibility of teaching a Sunday school class at the Lyell mission which was a couple of miles away from her church. And so on Sunday morning, she would, teach Sunday school and then go to church. And then after church, she would walk 2 miles to the Lyell Mission and teach Sunday school there. And then she would come back to Lake Avenue for the young people's meeting and for Sunday evening worship. So far from being a restful Sabbath, Sundays were full of work for her. She worked all day on Sunday in the church. But I think that taught her a tremendous sense of duty and responsibility towards church life and towards the kingdom of God.
And it seems like it speaks to just the genuineness of her decision to be part of the church and to follow
Right.
Christ. Maybe she didn't have that dramatic experience, but she certainly was living that lifestyle of service and being part of the people of God.
Yes.
Well, and also it seems like her father's influence of this life of ministry. And so her, kind of being impacted by that and following that in her teaching classes and teaching Sunday school and all of that.
Yeah, certainly so. Yes.
Can you help us, Kip, just kind of understand a little bit of the historical context of, her life and what was going on, just to kind of help us put that in perspective as we're learning more of her story?
So again, she's growing up during the second half of the 19th century. I think there are three really important things happening. The first is just in general the women's movement in the latter part of the 19th century, the development of the opening of higher education for women, and the development of colleges, especially for women, in the latter half of the 19th century. And the ecumenical women's missionary movement is in development at that time, too. So you have all of these, in every major Christian denomination, women are getting together and creating their own missionary societies to appoint women to serve as missionaries because, for the most part, the only way they could be appointed through the denominational boards was to go as the wife of a male missionary, right? And so the women's societies had roles for women to go on their own. And so these societies were in development. So those three things, I think, that were all happening in the latter half of the 19th century were very important for her. She, in Rochester, everybody knows Rochester was the home of Susan B. Anthony, who was the famous suffrage radical. Later on, after Montgomery finishes college and comes back to Rochester to live, Susan B. Anthony kind of takes her on as a protege. And so her relationship with Susan B. Anthony becomes important, and we can talk about that more. She was educated at Wellesley College. Again, this is a very important foundational experience for her. Alice Freeman Palmer, who's the second president of Wellesley, gave Montgomery a lot of attention, as she did many of the women who came through Wellesley in the early years. And Montgomery sees her as a role model and wants to be a new woman the way Alice Freeman, she knew her as Miss Freeman, before she left Wellesley and got married. She wants to be a new woman kind of in the way that Miss Freeman is a new woman. And then, when she's out of college, for the first 3 years after that, she has a brief teaching career and then comes back to Rochester and is married. But once she gets back to Rochester, she again gets very involved in the Lake Avenue Church, and not only the church, but the women's missionary organizations locally, and very quickly works her way up through the ranks in the missionary organizations until she's part of, the leadership of the national mission organizations for Baptist women.
Okay. Wow. So she had some pretty high up kind of connections. Not everyone has that kind of life.
She did.
beyond the influential women, you mentioned that she got married. So could you tell us more a little bit about that part of her life? Who was her husband? Did she have children? And then how did her faith continue to impact her work and what she was involved in?
Yeah. So she did after she graduated from Wellesley. Helen Barrett Montgomery. At that point, she was still Helen Barrett, and she spent 3 years teaching. 1 year in Rochester, and then 2 years in Philadelphia as co-principal of the Wellesley Preparatory School in Philadelphia. And then she returned to Rochester and she married a man named William A. Montgomery, who was a local businessman and a member of Lake Avenue Baptist Church. He was a deacon in the church. He had taken over her Sunday school class of boys when she left for Wellesley, and they had corresponded over the Sunday school class. That's their relationship developed apparently through their correspondence about this Sunday school class. And he was a widower, 7 years older than Helen, and she came after her experience in Philadelphia. She came home, and they were married. And he was a dedicated Christian layman, became a successful and prominent businessman and member of the community in Rochester. Again, he served as a Sunday school teacher, a deacon in the Lake Avenue Church for decades. He was a trustee of Colgate Rochester Divinity School. And he was an officer in the local chapter of Walter Rauschenbusch's Brotherhood of the Kingdom. One of the businesses that he started now, he had been in business, all of his adult life, had, like many entrepreneurs, had businesses that had some success and then had kind of a downturn. I mean, one of the businesses he was in burned to the ground, and, he almost lost everything. But he started this business called the Northeast Electric Company that pioneered the mass production of electric automobile starters. And so, in the old days, you had to crank, by hand, had to crank the engine to get a car started. So they came up with an electric automobile starter. And the Northeast Electric Company made these starters, and it was bought by General Motors. So the company that he started became part of General Motors. It became the Rochester Products Division of General Motors. And that made him fairly wealthy when General Motors bought his business. He then started, and this was much later in his life, he was much older at this point, but he started a typewriter business called the Electromatic Typewriter Company. And after he died, that business was purchased by IBM. So
Wow.
he had these two businesses that he started that became very successful and ended up making a lot of money when he sold them. And so, Helen, of course, benefited from that wealth creation. And by the end of her life, could do whatever she wanted to do whenever she wanted to do it. So she decided to go around the world on a world tour with Lucy Waterbury Peabody, and they took their daughters with them. They could do that, right? And so William Montgomery was her husband, very dedicated, very committed Baptist layman, and was willing to support her in all of her work. Whatever she did, he was willing to support her and help her do that work. He knew when he married her that, she had a very bright future and he was going to be supportive of her. Now, she would never leave home overnight or never commit to leaving home overnight without getting his permission first. But she always knew that he was going to support her in whatever she did.
It's really encouraging to hear about such a strong marriage back then of a woman being empowered in the marriage to use her gifts and her talents. And yeah, just it's encouraging to hear that. And also just sometimes you wonder where things came from, the
Right.
things that we use every day. Now we know where these two things kind of originated from.
Yeah, and they never had children of their own,
Mhm.
but when Helen was about 34 years old, they adopted a 5-year-old daughter named Edith. So Edith was their only child. But Helen had plenty to do in Rochester. She became very active in the civic and religious life of Rochester. She was active in the women's clubs, and most importantly, she became president of the Rochester Women's Educational and Industrial Union, the WEIU for short. And that organization sort of became her platform for everything that she did after that in Rochester. It's a very important organization in her life.
Yeah, did you want to tell us a little bit more about that? Just what she ended up doing with that group?
Yeah, so again, she was active in the women's clubs. Most of the women's clubs at that point, again, these are clubs for, middle class, upper class women. Mostly it's self-improvement and culture, kinds of things. But the WEIU is the first club in Rochester, the first women's club to move into municipal housekeeping, which is the idea that women by nature and because of their capacity for motherhood have a unique authority and a gender specific role to play in caring for the community. So it's, kind of a form of maternalist politics that claimed this special role for women as mothers, caregivers, and guardians of morality beyond their own homes, for the entire community. So this organization, the WEIU, again sets the platform for Montgomery's work as a municipal reformer in Rochester. She becomes the first president of the organization and serves for 10 years from 1893 to 1911 as president of the WEIU. And this organization did all kinds of stuff. They built playgrounds. They started kindergartens and summer schools. They created programs to educate mothers. They advocated for improvements to public school buildings. The WEIU provided legal protection for working class women who were abused or exploited or cheated by their employers. They advocated for women who were caught up in sex trafficking, and they worked with the courts and the police to help them find other means of employment. And, they did all of this based on the idea of this maternalist politics that said, women have this special role in the community to go places where men can't go. They have a special insight that men and a special perspective that men don't have. And on that authority, they move beyond the home and into the community and do this work, right? And so that was the way Montgomery got started in reform work in Rochester, was through this organization.
Laura, I know you've talked about kind of the idea of women's work for women.
Yeah.
Does that kind of fit with some of this work?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what she's a part of. She's part of the women's suffrage movement and the women's ecumenical missions movement, and that's exactly what they're doing, saying women are special in this particular way. They take care of kids, they're advocates in the home. Like, let's tap into who women are, and because we're women, we can do certain things. And that's a little bit different than we sometimes think about of women's like feminist movements. But
Sure.
this is actually the beginning of that, of like saying, yes, let's celebrate who women are. And then with that, kind of empower them to move out into the wider society and to use their specific gifts and callings. And that can be really great for women who feel like they fit those traditional roles. It can also feel a little bit disempowering for women who don't, who want something different, who want to not be put in those boxes. So it's kind of got a mixed feeling for women as they encounter those ideas in history. But I think they still exist today in various forms as well.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. And Montgomery, again, she never had children of her own. She adopted a daughter, right? But she always focused on motherhood as this special calling for women, and she called it the one essential profession, right? And she really wanted to think of motherhood as something important, something that required education and skill and expertise, and something that needed to be developed, and as this special role for women that was indispensable. And it was because of her maternalist politics that she becomes the first woman ever elected to the school board in Rochester, New York in 1899, long before women could even vote. She becomes the first woman elected to this public office in Rochester, New York.
Was she also involved in the church still in this time?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Her father passed away suddenly that same year. So the same year that she's elected to the school board in 1899, her father passes away suddenly. And in his memory, she organizes a Sunday school class called the Barrett Memorial Sunday School Class for Women in Lake Avenue Baptist Church. Now, this Sunday school class grows eventually to enroll 250 women. And Montgomery taught it every Sunday for 44 years, unless she was out of town. And this Sunday school class becomes an institution of itself, right? 250 women, they have a lot of resources. They can do a lot of things, right? And her lessons cover a wide range of topics, from the Bible to social issues to politics. And it was Montgomery's custom, and I think, again, she followed Alice Freeman in this. Freeman, when she was president of Wellesley, kept notes on all the students so that she knew stuff about them and could engage them in conversation whenever she interacted with them. She learned their names and took notes on their families and all that kind of stuff. And Montgomery made it a practice in this class of 250 women, and she called them her girls. She greeted her girls by name and always, introduced herself to visitors and new members and made it a personal relationship. And so, this Sunday school class becomes, again, a power center for her, a tremendous source of influence for her in the city of Rochester during the years when she's also leading the WEIU and also elected to the school board as the first woman ever to be in that position.
So she's just leading in every area of her life. Wherever she finds herself, she's leading and teaching and using her skills.
Exactly so. And it's during this same period of time that she becomes a licensed preacher in the Lake Avenue Church. Now, licensing in the Baptist tradition is different from ordination. Licensing is more like a letter of recommendation for your church, that you are someone who, teaches sound doctrine and are committed to, evangelism, right? Ordination is about fitness for pastoral service, leading a congregation. But anyone who intends to be involved with preaching and evangelism can seek licensing. You don't have to necessarily feel called to pastoral ministry to do that. And so in 1898, the church records show that she was listed as one of the licensed preachers in the Lake Avenue congregation. And also that she had preached twice in the church during that year. And the church would not have licensed her to preach unless she had filled the pulpit at least once so that the congregation could hear her preach and then vote on her licensing, right? And so she takes on that role. Now, she spoke very often throughout her life. She was the most frequent woman to speak in the Lake Avenue Church during her lifetime. Most of those occasions, though, weren't preaching. Most of the time she was, talking about missions or talking about something that was going on in the city, in the reform work of the city, or maybe sharing about some traveling that she had done, that kind of thing. So most of the time it wasn't a sermon, but she was a frequent speaker in her church through those years, the most frequent female speaker in the church in her lifetime.
So, yeah, tell us more about her involvement with missions. She's not the traditional kind of, cross-cultural missionary that we often feature on this podcast, but she's clearly involved in some way.
So her involvement with missions began as soon as she returned to Rochester after her brief, 3-year teaching career. In 1888, she and Lucy Waterbury, who later would become Lucy Waterbury Peabody, Lucy Waterbury was a missionary who actually, did serve overseas in missions. She'd been widowed and she came back to Rochester. She and Lucy Waterbury served as speakers at the Monroe Baptist Association. They spoke on mission-related topics. Also, speaking on that platform at that 1888 meeting was Caroline Atwater Mason. So all three of these women, Montgomery, Lucy Waterbury Peabody, and Caroline Atwater Mason, all of them would become leaders of the women's ecumenical missionary movement in America. And, by some kind of coincidence, they're all there on the platform at the Monroe Baptist Association in 1888 speaking about missions, right? And Montgomery, again, she starts out in her local Baptist association, in her local church, and in her local Baptist association. But very soon, she is leading in the national organizations. And she spoke at the 1900 Ecumenical Missionary Conference in New York City on behalf of the women's missionary organizations, right? She gave 2 addresses at that meeting on behalf of the women's missionary organization. So she moved up through the ranks and made her way to national prominence very quickly. As sort of this, I guess you might call her an organic intellectual of the movement, kind of this homegrown intellectual that comes out of the women's missionary movement and speaks on its behalf and writes on its behalf.
Yeah, I think sometimes we think of the men that were in those roles and we call them mission statesmen. So is she a mission stateswoman or a missiologist, the more modern term?
Yeah. So that kind of launched her, again, coming through her local Baptist church and through her local Baptist association. And, she just kept on going until she was leading nationally for the Baptists and part of this ecumenical movement.
So, Kip, would you mind just diving a little bit deeper into her development as this missionary stateswoman, this mission kind of scholar, the person who is speaking and teaching, even though she herself was never a missionary? How did that really come about, and what was she known for? What did she do?
So I talked about her growing up in a Baptist home and in a Baptist church where missions and evangelism were very important. But she also went to Wellesley College. She was educated there. And at that time, Wellesley was a non-denominational evangelical women's college where women's roles in missions, evangelism, Christian benevolence, and social reform were constant themes. So in Montgomery's day at Wellesley, students attended chapel twice daily. They had Bible class once a day. They participated in mandatory periods of silence twice a day. And professors often led student engagement in missionary service, um, supported by the idea that women had this special gender-specific role in Christian mission. So this was the consciousness that Wellesley sort of educated into Montgomery, and it built on what she'd already learned at home and what she'd already learned at church. And it really shaped her view of the world and her view of her own sense of calling and vocation. So the idea at the bottom of this maternalist political activism and social reform is what becomes known as woman's work for woman. And this was the original missiology of the ecumenical women's missionary movement. And so I mentioned earlier that in 1900 she attended the Ecumenical Missionary Conference in New York City as a representative of the Women's Baptist Foreign Missionary Society. It was the largest missionary conference ever held in the United States to that point. She spoke twice. In one of her addresses, she called for a systematic interdenominational study of missions for women's missionary organizations. And in the other address, she defended the need for separate, independent women's missionary organizations because already those organizations were coming under criticism that they were redundant, since every denomination had a denominational missionary society. So her plan for systematic mission study for women organizations came to be, it was brought to life in the Central Committee on the United Study of Foreign Missions, which was a cooperative effort among the women's boards. They published annual mission study books and other resources for more than 35 years. So these annual books were published every year for decades. And Montgomery wrote 6 books for the Central Committee between 1906 and 1929. Her most famous one, though, was the 1910 book, Western Women in Eastern Lands. It commemorated 50 years of organized mission work by American women. It sold 100,000 copies. And Lucy Waterbury Peabody was reading the manuscript when she had this idea for a year-long national Jubilee celebration of American women's missionary work. And that idea led to the creation of the Jubilee Tour, the Golden Jubilee Tour. It was the largest and longest celebration of missions in history. Beginning in 1910, the Jubilee Tour traversed North America, starting in the West, visiting 33 major cities. And then there were satellite celebrations that the main tour did not visit, but satellite celebrations in an additional 37 smaller cities. And so the main tour had Montgomery as the headliner. She was the main speaker. And along with her, there was a rotating group of well-known women missionaries on furlough in the United States. They started in Oakland, California in October. They traveled 40 days, spending 2 days in each city they visited. And sometimes on this tour, Montgomery spoke as many as 9 times in a single day. And so it was an amazing, event. They took a Christmas break, and then they covered the eastern half of the country, visiting. Of course, you couldn't skip Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., they presented a leather-bound autographed copy of Western Women in Eastern Lands to President Taft. And then they ended up with a huge celebration in New York City in March of 1911. They raised more than $1 million for women's missions through this tour.
That's incredible.
It's incredible. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, there's not too many gender specific spaces anymore and in terms of missions. And I feel like Velvet Ashes is just resting on the shoulders of these women that were doing this phenomenal jubilee, and all the research and all the speaking and the fundraising. It's incredible to think about the history that has come before us.
Yeah, I love that.
So between 1910 and 1920, I think Helen Barrett Montgomery was the most influential leader and intellectual of the American women's missionary movement. She envisioned the Interdenominational Committee on Christian Literature for Women and Children in Heathen Lands, which, again, published literature for women and children in mission fields all around the world. She called for closer cooperation among the women's boards, and that led to the Federation of Women's Boards for Foreign Missions. She led the women's boards to adopt a single day for prayer, and that eventually became the World Day of Prayer. She and Lucy Waterbury Peabody went on a world tour of women's mission work, and she wrote about that world tour in her 1915 book, The King's Highway, and that book sold 160,000 copies, and it led to an effort on the part of the women's boards to start women's colleges around the world for women in the mission churches. Those are some of her accomplishments. That's not everything, but those are some of her accomplishments.
Okay, but this is just incredible hearing about all of the things that she did. And I think sometimes we can either look back at these stories with sort of, this romantic idea of all of the great things that someone did. But we also know there are things that we today might have questions or concerns about. And so as you have gotten to know Helen and her life, are there any things that, you maybe have questions or concerns about or wonder about?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to do a second edition of my biography is because I didn't give enough attention to the issues of race, gender, and class in the first edition. Despite Montgomery's brilliance and her sincere Christian devotion, I think she was largely blind to her own privilege, and that blindness affected her work in countless ways. In her reform work in Rochester, she and her WEIU colleagues tried to teach, white middle-class values and virtues in all sorts of ways, including through Montgomery's public lectures, through art exhibits they organized, mothers' clubs. They focused their attention largely on the communities of European immigrants who were flooding into the United States at the time. And while they treated the needs and concerns of Rochester's tiny African American community, which at that time numbered less than 1,000 people, with relative indifference. Working class women of any race or ethnicity were clients and targets of reform, but they were not necessarily considered colleagues and peers of the reform women's organizations. So when Montgomery transitioned into the leadership of the mission movement, her approach remained much the same. The Jubilee Tour, for example, was segregated, separate meetings for Black women. The portrayal of women of color in the movement's missionary pageants and their literature often indulged in stereotypes. Montgomery's 1906 mission study book on the Pacific Islands is full of racist language that I assume she thought was scientific. And so, there were these kinds of problems. Several years ago, New Testament scholar Sharon Dowd was writing about, Montgomery's New Testament translation, and she wrote that Montgomery's work was full of cultural imperialism, religious triumphalism, unconscious ethnocentrism, and postmillennial zeal. And I can't disagree with any of that. And this is not just Montgomery. I think it was the whole ecumenical women's missionary movement. It was rooted in the rise of the white middle class in the United States. And they sincerely used the rhetoric of sisterhood to talk about their relationships with women around the world. But that language cloaked, I think, their hierarchical cultural assumptions. They saw women and girls in non-Christian lands as oppressed and degraded, and they assigned themselves the dominant role in the sisterhood. They were the experts on the needs of global womanhood. They were the protectors and defenders of women in non-Christian lands. After the First World War, the missiology of the movement changes to world friendship, away from woman's work for woman to world friendship. And I think that perspective was perhaps less culturally imperialistic, but for Montgomery's part, her work was much more rooted in the older style.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that and just looking, critically in a way at some of these things that we wish could have been different, or that, now we maybe have a different perspective. But I think it's so good as we come to these stories to have a balanced approach of, we don't need to throw out their legacy or their influence, but we can really look critically and yet still learn from them. So yeah, I think that's so important.
And I think it's also a good reminder just to think critically about our own social space that we occupy, and what background we come from, and what kind of privilege we come from, and where we're serving, and the populations that we're working with, and how are we thinking about people from different backgrounds. And I think it's just a good reminder in all the work that we do, wherever we are. Because
and how can
it's human nature to have biases and prejudices.
Right.
And
how can we keep learning and growing?
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to mention her leadership among Baptists. She once said that, if the denominations all got together in one church, she would wear a little button under her lapel that says, "I'm a Baptist." So she loved her Baptist denomination. She loved that tradition. She believed in Baptist teachings and tradition, and she served her denomination. So she wrote in 1913, she wrote a history of Baptist missions called Following the Sunrise, which was published by the American Baptist Publication Society. She served as president of the Woman's American Baptist Foreign Missionary Society from 1914 to 1924, except for the year of 1922 when she stepped down because she'd been elected president of the Northern Baptist Convention, the first woman ever to serve as president of the Northern Baptist Convention. The reason she was elected president is because under her leadership, the Woman's American Baptist Foreign Missionary Society had raised $450,000 for missions in celebration of their 50th anniversary of organized work. And in the run-up to the 1922 convention, where she served as president, she worked with leaders, other leaders, more liberal leaders of the convention, to fend off a fundamentalist attempt to impose a creed on the convention, because all the teachers in the colleges and seminaries of the convention and all the missionaries would have had to sign the creed. And even though she agreed with the fundamentalists in some of their criticisms of theological liberalism, she believed that the creed would be destructive to the unity of the denomination and it would hurt missions. So she worked against it, and she was successful in fending that off. And in 1924, she published an original translation of the New Testament with the Baptist Publication Society. It was called the Centenary New Testament because it celebrated 100 years of the work of the American Baptist Publication Society. And it's a great little New Testament. She said that she had her little Baptist Sunday school boys in mind as she translated it, because she wanted a New Testament that they could understand. And in the front matter, she had a little declaration of discipleship so that you could sign your name and date it and know the date when you became a follower of Jesus. And so it was in that spirit that she translated the New Testament.
Wow. So many interesting experiences and stories from Helen's life. Thank you so much for just, all of these insights into her life. As you think about all of this, how would you sum up her legacy?
Well, in Rochester, New York, there's an elementary school that bears her name. Unfortunately, I think her name has largely been forgotten otherwise, except in Baptist circles, where many women still invoke her as a role model and an inspiration. Likewise, the institutional structure of the missionary movement that she helped to build is all but gone, at least in America. Changes in American society, new opportunities for education and professional development for American women in the 20th century meant that fewer women turned to the women's missionary societies in search of opportunities for leadership and service. And so by the mid-1960s, the women's societies were all gone. In most cases, when those mergers happened, they merged with the denominational boards. And in most cases, when those mergers happened, women lost power, which is exactly what Montgomery had predicted would happen as early as 1900. Yet when you look globally at Christianity today, you see that women are in the majority. And when you realize the role of women in the growth of Christianity in Asia, Africa, and Oceania, where women were often the earliest converts to Christianity, you see that the women's missionary movement was remarkably successful at planting seeds that have borne fruit. And I think women around the world are turning to Christianity for the same reasons that Protestant women in America created the women's missionary societies and worked together in the first place. They find sisterhood and support for their roles as mothers, resources they can use to care for their families, and they find improved quality of life for themselves and their families, and opportunities for education and leadership in societies that are not always open to women's education and leadership. So Montgomery and the women's ecumenical missionary movement built and supported schools and clinics, hospitals and libraries, orphanages, and many other institutions that served countless women and children around the world. And they established an enduring global infrastructure of education and social service that provided unprecedented opportunities and possibilities for women in non-Christian societies. And those women around the world used those resources to benefit themselves and their families. And today, their daughters and their granddaughters account for much of the growth of the global church. And that, I think, is Montgomery's legacy and the legacy of her movement.
I'm just struck by the holistic approach that you're describing there, that women were advocating for women, but they were doing it in a way that wasn't solely evangelism. They were, trying to look at women's lives and say, how can this be improved? How can it be better? And the women that they were working with clearly saw something that was different, and they wanted to be a part of it. And as you mentioned, the church has grown. They've passed on the faith to their children, and Montgomery was a part of that legacy. So it's thank you for sharing her story with us today, and for letting those of us who'd never heard much about her know more about her, and for those who had, knowing even more. I've definitely learned some things today that I didn't know about her, and I'm looking forward to your book that's coming out. You said it should be out in the next year or so.
Yeah, I don't have an exact date, but it's going to be in. They said it will be in the 25-26 catalog, so that means sometime in the next year. So, I hope that folks will look it up when it comes out. And let me also say that Montgomery's books are still available. I mean, most of them are not in print anymore. I think the Baylor University Press re-released The Bible and Missions a number of years ago. So I think that one's still in print. But you can find copies of her books on used book sites and things like that, and they're still worth reading. And so I would encourage people to look up her books and see what she has to say. She has a very subtle and sophisticated theology of the kingdom of God in her books.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kip, again for just being with us and like we said earlier, just helping us not to forget these people that, are part of the history of what God has done around the world. And, even though Helen didn't maybe go herself as, a missionary in the way that we typically talk about missionaries on this podcast, she was very much part of inviting people into what God was doing locally and around the world. And that's such an important part of the way that the Spirit is working. And so, yeah, such a privilege to get to hear Helen's story. So thank you.
And it's my pleasure and privilege to tell her story. She, even though she didn't serve as a missionary, she had a missionary heart, and she dedicated her life to that cause.
Yeah. Well, friends, thank you so much for being with us today for the Velvet Ashes Legacy podcast. And we are just so grateful to Barnabas International for sponsoring this podcast. You can learn more about how they shepherd global workers and train global shepherds by checking out the show notes for this episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, we hope that you will share it with others and let us know also. We love getting to hear from you, and all of that information for how to do that is in the show notes as well. So join us next month for another episode of the Velvet Ashes Legacy Podcast.
What a pleasure to be home in you, God.